Welcome to Season 3 of Pathfinder's Pod, conversations with intrapreneurs on systems change and leadership across the world. My name is Odette, and today we have a conversation with Pascal Finette on his new book, Disrupt Disruption. This episode is hosted by co-founder of the League, Maggie de Pree.
Pascal, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here in this virtual space today to talk about disruption and, in fact, disrupting disruption. So we will come on to that in a minute. But first, I just wanted to briefly introduce you to our listeners who may not know you or be familiar with your work. So you have a very long history of disruptive innovation, which I know we're going to get into. Currently leading an organization called Be Radical, so a consultancy that's really empowering and advising company leaders to create the future that they want to be a part of rather than get disrupted. And there's a lot of change happening now. So I'm sure you're providing really valuable support to those folks that just don't understand things like, how is AI relevant to my business and where should I even be putting my energy? You have 30 plus years. I don't know how you do it. You look so young. So you must have started when you were about a teenager, but, decades of experience working in disruptive and radical innovation. And, for some really incredible brands like Google and Mozilla and eBay. So lots of practitioner experience that you're drawing on in both your consulting advisory and the book. And you're a great storyteller too. That's something I've really observed about you. So looking forward to hearing a few of those stories today. Pascal, before we dive into the work, I just wanted to hear a little bit from you about your journey and how you came to this place, and really, when did you discover you had a gift for disruption?
Well, first of all, Maggie, it's incredible to be here with you today. Also, that was quite the bombastic introduction. I am not sure if I can live up to that. We will see. Very, very briefly, honestly, I keep telling these people, in hindsight, CVs make a lot of sense. At least my CV makes a lot of sense. In the moment, it was always very, very messy, and I was always driven by, and I think that's probably my defining characteristic, curiosity. So I was always very, very curious about the world, even as a, proverbial, like the taking the toaster apart thing as a child, I did. And then, of course, I could never put it back together. So that's the reason why I didn't become an engineer. But then I was also just very fortunate to be at the right place at the right time. I started my career really when I was in college. The first .com boom happened. So this is early mid 90s. Computers became a thing. I was always like pretty computer geeky-ish. So I was just like at the right place. And then I saw how the internet truly disrupted, or started to disrupt, I should say, industry after industry. I was part of the team which built eBay. We saw the internet disrupting retail and commerce. We saw Skype happening, which disrupted the telecommunications industry. Communications being disrupted by email, etc. I remember when I was in college, I was part of the computer club there. We had a pretty good computer center at the university I studied at. And, remembering getting my first email and email address. And this is, pre-proper World Wide Web internet. And, I didn't know what to do with an email because there were nobody to send emails to. So, I think that really seeded this understanding or this idea around that there's so much happening in the world. There's so much disruptive power happening in the world that I got just really fascinated by this topic. And I was very fortunate to essentially spend my career with companies or with my own company, really exploring this further and gaining some insights. So kind of that's where it came from. But it's really, for me, it's anchored in just like a thirst for understanding what's happening in the world.
I love that idea of curiosity. And it's interesting listening to you talk about the disruptions of those, things like the internet and Skype and what have you, that we, at the time, I feel like you've transported us back a little bit to that moment. And now we're sitting here again at a very transformational moment and how we make sense of it, right? It's easy now to look back and say, well, of course the internet was disruptive. Of course things like Skype were disruptive. But at the time, when they were still what you call weak signals, not everybody had an email address. Like, how do we know this is going to be a thing? And you really explore that a bit in your book. So want to come back to that idea of weak signals and how you sense what's going to be disruptive, what to pay attention to, and how to filter a bit through the noise of everything.
Yeah, and I think for me, this starts with understanding that most of us, we look at what is, and we don't necessarily ask all that much what could be. And, here's a beautiful example out of my own life. Again, and I'm dating myself here, but I very vividly remember buying a Palm Pilot in 1996. The thing was called a personal digital assistant. And, some of the listeners will remember this thing. You had your address book on there, your notebook, your calendar. You could actually install apps on it. And with hindsight, you look at this device today, of course, and you see it looks a lot like a very crude early version of an iPhone, sans the internet connectivity. Now, the interesting question is, and this is true for myself, in 1996, I was incredibly excited about these devices because they were really amazing. Like, you had this mini computer in your pocket, the first time you had a computer in your pocket properly. But most of us couldn't see that this will become eventually an iPhone, because most of us, again, we didn't ask the question of what could be. Now, there's a second wrinkle to this, of course, is even in 1996, if you would have seen this device and said, oh my God, this is going to be a full-on communication device, a computer in your pocket, blah, blah, blah. Then the question arises is if you would have anticipated that it will take us 11 years to get to the iPhone, right? The iPhone didn't appear until 2007. So there's this interesting dichotomy between, on one hand, can we actually even see these early indicators of change? Can we imagine what they can be? But then also, can we imagine how long it will take? And the really interesting filtering question for me is when you're trying to suss out hype from reality, because clearly we are awash in a world of hype. I mean, just go back just a couple of years, we had the blockchain, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, the metaverse, to the point that a very large corporation renamed itself Meta, right? So all of that stuff is happening. And then, of course, Maggie, you mentioned all the other changes we see in the world, climate change, social injustice, et cetera, rise of populism, et cetera. So the question really becomes, which of those will become real and in which timeframes? And for me, at least when it comes to technology, I think there's a couple of factors you want to look at. One being, if you look carefully and really force yourself to do the hard deconstruction, you can actually determine when a technology becomes ripe for mass consumption, as in, at least with some accuracy, as in, when is it good enough? And we tend to not do that because we tend to look at technology often in aggregate. We say the metaverse. The metaverse isn't a thing. The metaverse is headsets and connectivity and tools and software and all kinds of things. The second one is we need to take into account the surrounding factors. So the head and the tailwinds, stuff like regulation, for example, or social acceptance, right? So for the metaverse, for example, if you come to me and say, well, the next time you will watch the Super Bowl, you will put on these like VR goggles and sit on the pitch, and it sounds amazing, right? Because you're right there with the players. At the same time, I'm like, well, people watch the Super Bowl because they want to eat guacamole, they want to drink a beer, and they want to be with their friends. I have a hard time imagining doing that with these goggles on, right? And then the last one is really, and this is the probably most important one, is it even useful? Does it even solve a problem? And I think that's where a lot of the hype we see around, blockchain or crypto, et cetera, really falls flat, because a lot of that stuff doesn't really solve a user problem, which then gets us to AI, which is clearly the topic at the moment. And I think AI is really fascinating because it seems to tick those boxes. And that's the reason why we are particularly excited about AI, because it really, in some circumstances, not all of them, clearly, it does really solve some really interesting problems.
Well, I know we just had a podcast on AI with one of our fellows who's looking at that issue, and I'm curious your thoughts, thinking about our audience who are often working on some of these social and environmental issues, those kinds of disruptions and real problems that matter in the world, using their organizations, their companies as platforms for change. Thinking about AI, I mean, where do you see what could be with this when we think about solving some of those big, wicked challenges for the world?
The way I look at it is AI is good at a couple of things. One is it is fairly good at making sense of very large sets of data, way better than most of the tools we have, and or much cheaper, right? So where you might have needed an army of data analysts or data scientists, you can now use an AI tool, or in the near future, we'll use an AI tool to do that, which I think will allow us to look at very complex problems, which seem intangibly to be solved, and we really can rethink how to solve those. There's some good examples being, early indicators of that in the field of AI, where we use AI, for example, to essentially run through a whole bunch in pharma, for example, a whole bunch of molecule combinations, assess their potential to then narrow them down to a smaller subset of highly likely molecules which solve a particular ailment, for example, which we then hand over to the scientists to then basically do targeted research on a much smaller subset of molecules. So a good example for that is in the protein folding space, Google's AI is doing truly incredible work. So I think that's one side. The other side is AI is, particularly generative AI, is actually really good at supporting us with idea generation. So this notion of when you think about open innovation and the insight in open innovation, that it's really not about having better ideas, it's about having more ideas, because the bigger the pool is, if you have a very quick and good way to assess that idea pool, it is much more likely that you find alpha, the outliers, the stuff which really works, the stuff which is exceptional and not just the median. And AI is actually really good at generating those ideas. There's a very simple example. Just a week ago, I was with a professor, and he told me he's writing a book and he needed to have a title for the book. And, he and his publisher, they came up with 20 titles for the book. And then out of a joke, basically, he went on to GPT and had GPT generate 500 titles for the book. And those 500, 490 were garbage. But there's 10 in there, which are really interesting and unique. So I'm really excited about us looking at AI as a tool to help us sift through data and make sense of the world, and also as a tool to generate just vast amount of idea and spark ultimately human creativity. This is where humans and AI will play together, I think.
I love that framing. It feels like it's just supercharging our problem solving capability. So it's a great framing. So want to bring it back to this idea of disruption in the book that you've published, which I have here. So I know we're maybe on video as well. So disrupting disruption. I mean, this is a word, as you indicate in your book, is maybe even overused. It's been a word that's been around for a while, and I think you list something like 4,000 publications or books, with that in the title. So I'm just really curious, why another book on disruption? What moved you to write this book?
So first of all, I don't think we need yet another book on disruption, including mine, just so we're clear. What motivated me was I was working at Singularity University at the time, which is this interesting think tank based out of Silicon Valley, and you could not avoid the word disruption. It was literally everywhere was talked about, every talk was about it, every conversation was about it, and you opened a business magazine or something, and every second headline is about disruption. So I really felt that we're using this word very similar to, it has become something I like to talk about this as tofu. Tofu, of course, is soy-based substrate, a staple in the Asian cuisine. I eat a lot of tofu. I'm vegetarian. It tastes like absolutely nothing, and then you put sauce on it, it tastes like the sauce. Disruption is the same thing. It doesn't mean anything anymore, sadly. And it just means whatever we want it to mean. So I got pretty interested in like really trying to figure out what does disruption actually mean today. And clearly we're standing on the massive shoulders of huge giants like Clayton Christensen, who coined the term disruptive innovation. So we took a bit of an antithetical perspective to disruption, because we started talking to a lot of people about what disruption really means, and people who've been really good at managing these transformations of their companies from, one way of doing things to another. And the headline is, and it's the reason why we wrote the book, because we think we have a perspective on disruption, which I hope is refreshingly solid and grounded, which really is this idea that if you look at disruption, you need to understand that in any disruption scenario I can think about, so your classic stories, the Kodak, Blockbusters, Nokias, Blackberries, what have you, if you think about what is the underlying job to be done for the customer, so the thing the customer originally wanted the product or service do for them, and again, this goes back to Clayton Christensen, if you think about that underlying job, it doesn't change. What changes is the way we fulfill this. And we talked about earlier about e-commerce. And the underlying job is still, you want to get a nice sweater, right? And back in the day, you walked into a store, and now you're going online. Same thing is that you still want that sweater, but the way you purchase it has changed. And, in the future, it might be you get influenced by a social media influencer and you buy it on Instagram or TikTok, right? So we started from that perspective. And the most interesting thing is, once we started doing this research, we came across a rather obscure comment Jeff Bezos, no other than Jeff Bezos, made at a conference. And he said, and I think he summarizes this so beautifully. So I literally, let me give you my best Jeff Bezos interpretation. But he said, the thing is, everybody asks you what is going to change. And that's a great question. Nobody ever asks you what's not going to change. And then he said, like, the interesting thing is about what's not going to change is that that is what you build your business on. Here's a good example. Think about Amazon retail. Amazon retail, what is Amazon retail? It's vast selection, low prices, fast shipping. That's what it is at its core. And he's like, I have a really hard time imagining in 10 years, someone coming to you and saying, man, Jeff, I love Amazon. I just wish your prices would be a little higher. Or I love Amazon. I just wish you would ship a little slower. And he's right? These things don't change. And thus we can actually build our business strategies on them. So we build our whole understanding of disruption on this idea that first understand what is the customer need, truly understand what's the customer need you're actually fulfilling with your product. Then assess if that is going to change. And I'm very confident it is not going to change in the future. And then think about, how do I actually fulfill that need in better ways? And that's all there is to it.
I love that idea, and just the value of asking good questions, right? In that simple example of not focusing always on just what's changing, but what's going to stay the same. I think it's a beautiful question. And I guess the question that's coming to me listening to you, given our audience, who are many of whom will be intrapreneurs, those kind of innovators that aren't sitting at the top of the organization. I'm sure you've found yourself in that position before. Would you have your views on intrapreneurs and disruption, and like what role do they play and I would say in the ecosystem, not just in the company, right? As opposed to entrepreneurs and other types of actors in a space.
Yeah, so I think as an entrepreneur, so as a startup person, a startup founder, you have the huge benefit that you don't have any legacy. So for you, if you're thinking about disruption, and we talk about disruption as a state change, so this idea that you go from one way of doing things to another way of doing things, whereas the underlying consumer need doesn't change. And it's often very exponential in it's a kind of like a snapping function. It's kind of like a step function when you go from one way to the other. So if you're an entrepreneur, you have the benefit of your new state often requires new tools, processes, CapEx, OpEx, etc. You have no legacy, so you can build fresh. It's pretty easy, right? So if you're, to stay in the e-commerce example, if you are Macy's and you run a whole bunch of big department stores, and now you need to do e-commerce and the department stores aren't a thing anymore, you're saddled with that legacy. If you are eBay, you don't have any of that stuff. So you can just like snap into this. So I think the role of the intrapreneur is incredibly important, because the intrapreneur is the person who makes a legacy, a incumbent organization move from one state to the next. And I think the most important thing, I believe, for an intrapreneur is not the most, but like surely one of the more important things, is for them to remind the company what their job to be done actually is. Because every once in a while I find companies, and it's not very uncommon, I find companies which one of the people we interviewed for the book once called paperclip companies. And paperclip companies are companies which are really good at making paperclips. And they become the best in the world at making paperclips. But at one point, they forget why they make paperclips. They just focus on being the best paperclip company in the world. And once you forgot that, as long as paperclips are a thing, you're golden. But the moment paperclips are not a thing anymore, and you've forgotten what your true job to be done is for your customer, you have an issue, because you can't move. And so I believe the role of the intrapreneur truly is, they're the heart, the engine, the brain of any company. They're the people who move these companies forward. So I think their role is to constantly remind the company, what is the job to be done we're doing for our customer? How do we fulfill this today? And maybe how do we do this better today? But also, how can we better fulfill this tomorrow using, new technologies, changes in the environment, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because, in that way, that requires, storytelling and narratives. And we do a lot of work with entrepreneurs in the league around building that capacity. Yes. And often it is, I watch entrepreneurs go back to the origin story.
Yes.
Like, why did we get us in this business in the first place? And you look at companies like Johnson & Johnson that have their credo, those touchstones that we go back to again and again about who, not only, what's the job to be done, but who are we serving and why? So that real fundamental purpose. And again, I would say purpose is a word like disruption that's gotten, a bit tofuized, if you will, but that to me is fundamental, right? Is like, why do we even exist? And remembering what it was, and then playing it forward into, as you said, what is that going to look like going forward in these new contexts? I was really struck reading the book around the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, because every single one of them, I thought any entrepreneur reading this will be nodding vigorously. Yeah. And in particular, I forget the colors, but you have one that talks about the immune response. Right. And then you have one that talks about time horizon. So maybe you could share a bit more about that. And again, thinking from the entrepreneur's perspective, like one, what are they, but also how do you navigate those horsemen?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And talking about storytelling. So here's a little bit of the origin story where this came for us. So as we were working with our clients and we did all these interviews for this book, it just became apparent to me that there is a certain set of challenges companies have very regularly when they're trying to do innovative work, and then ultimately leading to disruptive work. And so we started cataloging them. And my fundamental belief is, I'm an athlete in my other life, and there's this thing in if you train for, let's say you train for a marathon, and you have some ailments in your body, say your knees are giving out, like a bit of ACL issues, etc. You don't even need to start training for a marathon if you haven't fixed these ailments beforehand, because they will just get so much in your way. And I think the same is true if you're thinking about innovation and disruption. There's a set of problems we face very regularly in organizations. And I believe you can do the most beautiful design thinking and, whatever workshops to really elevate your craft. If you haven't fixed the basic issues, you will just stumble over them over and over again. And this is like, it's for naught. So we found these. We found that there's 4 very common ones. And then talking about storytelling, because we started telling them to our clients and they kind of nodded, but it didn't sink in. And we were like, you know what? We need an image. which gets people to listen to this. So we call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And very briefly, and I'm sure everybody who's listening will like just nod with their heads, you know, like saying like, oh my God, like totally, I get this. First of all, I believe by giving them names, by the way, it makes it much easier for people to talk about them. And they're often not that hard to overcome, but if you can't even talk about them, you can't do anything about them. So first one is classic fear of cannibalization. So you know there's something out there, you know the new thing is coming. It typically makes you less money in the beginning, particularly. You know, like you go from stores to e-commerce. E-commerce is much smaller, margins might be different, etc. So you avoid it, you don't do it. It's kind of ironic because that thing, like literally they teach you in business school 101, and we're still stumbling over it. So good to know. Second one is we call this the leverage what you have fallacy. So the classic example here is, and we talked about this earlier, or I alluded to this earlier a little bit. You have existing CapEx and OpEx, you know, structures, tools, machinery, whatever. So there's a very strong incentive for the incumbent organization to leverage this, to use it, which is fine if you're in what Clayton Christensen once called a sustaining innovation scenario. You know, you make the iPhone 12, you make the 13, the 14, the 15. Of course, you want to use the same machinery. But when you are in a disruptive scenario where suddenly you move from like doing things from one way of doing it to a whole different new way of doing things, that stuff gets in your way. So good example here is the move to the cloud, you know, from on-premise IT infrastructure to the cloud. If you have invested a lot of money into your on-premise infrastructure, it's really hard to shed that, right? But it is at the same time a massive burden on you as you're going into this future. The third one is, you spoke about this already, we call this immune system response. So very similar to the human immune system, every company has an immune system. And it's good because it defends you from these outside forces, from the competition and, you know, from all kinds of other forces. And the thing with the immune system is that sometimes it starts to calcify and you get to this autoimmune disease where the immune system defenders not only defend to the outside, but they defend to the inside. So you get to this, I'm sure everybody has this experience, to get to this experience where you sit in a meeting and you say, I've got an idea. So you're the brave intrapreneur coming up with the idea, and someone in the meeting inevitably says, that's not how we do things here. And that's the end of the discussion. A friend of mine once called this, so I grew up in Germany, and a friend of mine who's also German mentioned in Germany, you have the aubergine person. And the aubergine or eggplant for our American friends. The eggplant person is the person who sits there in a suit, which is aubergine colored. And again, that might be a very German thing. And their sole reason for existence is to say no. Mm. And in, you know, 8 out of 10 cases, that's great because they save you from like making stupid mistakes. But in 2 of them, they actually destroy like all kinds of innovation. And then the very last one is the time horizon fallacy. And this goes back to, I believe McKinsey invented this idea around the 3 time horizons: time horizon 1, here and now; time horizon 2, the in-between, 2 to 5 years out; time horizon 3, research and development, 10 years out. And and this goes back to Geoffrey Moore, the guy who wrote Crossing the Chasm. He points out that there's this really interesting fallacy in time horizon 2. If you operate in time horizon 2, and again, time horizon 2 is kind of like the thing which comes next. So you are the fearless intrapreneur currently working on the AI project. And you go to your leader, and your leader operates typically in time horizon 1. Your leader then applies time horizon 1 thinking and metrics to your time horizon 2 problem. And they will ask you, well, Maggie, that's great. When will it make us $10 million or has 100,000 customers? And if you're truthful in time horizon 2, because you're building the future, right? You will sit there and you're like, I don't know. Nobody's ever done this before. That's the whole point about this. And then you will typically not get the resources. Now, eventually, of course, we entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, we wisen up to this game. So we now produce the PowerPoints and the Excel spreadsheets, which show you like the exponential growth. And it's like, you know, fabricated to say the least, but you know, whatever, it's fine. It gets us to the resources. And then 2 other fallacies happen. One is when time horizon 1, the here and now, falls on hard times, you know, economic downturn, COVID, God knows what. they love to plunder the resources from time horizon 2, which is dangerous because time horizon 2 is this future, right? But it doesn't make any money at the moment. So it's a very compelling argument to say, oh, give me back the resources. We need them here. And then the third piece is, and Geoffrey pointed this out, is that as an organization, at any given time, you can only move one project, one major project, through from time horizon 2 to time horizon 1. Because if you take 2 or more, you just confuse internal and external stakeholders. Point in case, when Apple introduced the iPhone, they had the iPad ready. It was there. And Apple actually worked with Geoffrey, and Geoffrey said, you need to pick one. So Steve Jobs picks the iPhone, goes out, presents the iPhone 2007. There's a journalist who asked Steve about tablets, because tablets were in the air. That wasn't like a new idea. And he said, Steve, what about tablets? Are you going to build a tablet? And Steve looked at him, and he knew that he needed to protect the market, right? He knew that he can only do one thing. So he said to this journalist, we are never going to build a tablet. That's the dumbest idea on the planet. Tablets are terrible. 2.5 years later, of course, they introduced the iPad. Steve says verbatim, this is the most important product I've ever worked on. This same journalist comes to him and said, Steve, didn't you tell me 2.5 years ago it's a stupid idea? And Steve just looks at him, blanks at him, and says, oh, I never said that. Right? So the beauty of Apple, if you think about it, is, and there's actually a quote about this, Steve Jobs said, we have one team working on one thing. And now, of course, they work on a million things, of course, obviously, internally. But to the outside world, when Apple commits, they're committed. They brought out the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple Watch, now the Vision Pro headset. Once they're committing, it's the thing. And that's, I think, part of their success story. So we need to overcome those. And again, we call them the horsemen. There's also, by the way, recently someone in an interview asked me, so Pascal, I get the horse people. By the way, people, not men, right? So just very clear. I get the horse people, but what's the horse? And I was really, I was confused. What do you mean? And it's like, well, they ride on horses, right? So what's the horse? And I was like, oh. So I think the horse is that everybody is always busy. I think that's the number one excuse in any company where nothing gets done.
Yeah.
Because everybody is like, oh, I can't do that. I'm just too busy. And I get it. Everybody is busy, but we do need to make time for the future.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the meeting culture, there's just no space and time for asking better questions, coming up with new ideas, sensing the weak signals. Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. You and I had a conversation earlier about who's doing this well. So a lot of the examples, are kind of the familiar ones. But when we spoke, what struck me was that you suggested that actually the companies that are privately held often have an easier time of disruption. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. We're very privileged because we get to work with both publicly held companies, and some of them are incredibly innovative, make no mistake, as well as privately held companies, and very often family-owned companies. So we do a lot of work in Latin America where there's a very common business structure. And what strikes me with these companies is they have their own idiosyncrasies, make no mistake, but because they're family-owned, often multi-generational, the questions they ask is typically a question of, how do we ensure that this company, this conglomerate, this entity is around in the next 50 years? So they ask very long time frame questions, whereas the common question in a publicly traded company is very often, how do we make the next quarter? And I get where this comes from, make no mistake. So how do we make next quarter? And maybe something like, how do we fill the pipeline for the next year or two? And those are very different questions leading to very different outcomes in the way you think about your investments, in the way you think about the patience it takes. One thing which struck me is that in the conversations we had is, and we know this, if you think about a startup, the average time it takes an overnight startup success to be successful is 5 to 7 to 10 years. So, we talk about these companies, oh my God, look at that, Airbnb just came out of nowhere. And in reality, it takes 7 years. There's a reason why venture capital funds are set up to be typically 7 to 10 years. In companies, if you think about high potentials, for example, in big corporations, we move high potentials around. They don't stay in a job for longer than 2 years. And I get why we're doing it, right? Because we want to expose them to new insights, ideas, etc. But what do you think, if you have an important project, you put a high potential on there, you move them around every 2 years, what do you think the next high potential will do when they get into that project? They will need to leave their mark, right? Clearly, because they're high potential. So they change everything. It's no wonder that we can't get anything done. And one of the things which really struck me is we spoke to a gentleman called Gisbert Rühl, who used to be the CEO of Klöckner Steel, very large steel company in Europe. Incredible success story of transforming a truly manufacturing-based steel company into a digital powerhouse. They started an online marketplace for the steel industry. Is massive now, absolutely massive. And he told me about the journey. And he said, listen, when I started this journey, I thought it will take us 5 years. So he literally went to the board and said, 5 years, friends, this will take me a long time. It took him 7. And he's like, it just takes time. You can't do these things overnight. And I think, sadly, there's very little patience we seem to have. And also the structures don't support it. We talked about the high potentials, but also the average tenure of a Fortune 500 CEOs is less than 5 years, and it's declining. So, again, no wonder we don't get anything done, because nobody allows themselves, and the capital markets typically don't support it, to think longer term.
So this seems to me to be a huge area for disruption, right?
Huge.
The actual system in which we're working. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on disrupting at a system level, like the capital market system?
Yeah, absolutely. So 100%. I think that the way Eaton economics, like the capital markets, how we're set up today, how they're structured and how they're set up. And I'm not an expert in this, so please don't quote me on it. But from my perspective, it really feels like a lot of the challenges we have in the world today are at least compounded by the way our markets work. There's efforts, for example, in the US, there's now a long-term capital market, a long-term stock exchange. So companies which list on that exchange actually commit themselves to much longer time planning horizons, to become really thinking about multi-generational, becoming stewardships. If you think about the environment, for example, if you are short-term motivated, of course you exploit the planet. If you're long-term motivated, if you're thinking about what is the planet I leave, what is the work I leave for my children and my children's children, you think very differently. I do think that this is a huge, huge opportunity for us to really rethink our capital markets, our social structures, governmental structures, etc., to really support longer and long-term thinking. I love
that idea of the multi-generational stakeholder. And I'm sure you will have seen Apple's recent video with Mother Nature in the boardroom, and it's a really powerful idea, and they only take it so far as the company that exists within the current market system. Like, they're still selling products for obsolescence, and they have to do the quarterly returns. But this idea of who are our stakeholders, and starting to build in the planet and future generations literally into those systems and structures and governance models. And like what the B Corp movement has been doing. And it's, talking about governance, people's eyes glaze over, but this feels like a really exciting place for disruption. I'd love to see you spend more time there.
Yeah, it is definitely important. It is very important. And I mean, here's the other thing to consider, and I'm just putting this out for every intrapreneur who is, just piqued, at least in their curiosity, is if you shift systems by just margin, small margins, the impact you can have is massive. There's a beautiful example, which I find really interesting from a company perspective. The reason why in the United States you can't buy incandescent light bulbs anymore, so normal light bulbs, they're basically specialty items these days, right? It's all LEDs, is that one day, for whatever reason, and I don't know the backstory of this, but for whatever reason, Walmart, which is largest retailer here in the United States, the head buyer of Walmart for light bulbs basically went to all their suppliers and said, we're not going to sell incandescent anymore. And it's wild. And like, I have no idea why they made that choice, but because their purchasing power is so big, they forced the whole industry to basically say, oh God, like we need to do LEDs, we need to do them cheaply, we need to like deliver them in quantities to Walmart, etc. And now you can't buy incandescents anymore, right? So there is this interesting leverage you have when you start poking the bear and really working on the system level. And I really encourage everybody to think about what might feel like a tiny, tiny change, you know, convincing your boss at Walmart that incandescent light bulbs is not the right thing anymore, might have massive ripple-on effects.
Well, it's true, and it's why we work with entrepreneurs. And another time, I worked for 8 years in transforming the market for compact fluorescent light bulbs, so I know the story, and it is fascinating. And it is it's about being intentional about shifting the system, so we can't leave it up to chance. We have to look at what are the systems that need to shift, and where does the power lie in that system. And so it was with the buyers in these big major retailers. And so you had, armies of organizations, going out and convincing them and persuading them and making the case. But really, at the end of the day, it was about their bottom line. Because guess what? When you buy a compact fluorescent, they're making way more money per light bulb than they are on the incandescent. So, still it's back to market economics and not so much the altruism. But yes, well, yeah, I guess I don't know. I think I'm going to pause here so you can edit this piece out. I've got more questions, but I do also feel like we've got a really nice, meaty podcast here. So I don't want to like keep kind of running on. I saw Mick had a question in the chat. And Mick, you're very welcome to come off mute and ask your question if you're in a place you can do so. And if not,
actually, I'm about to attend family dinners, but I'm still have my earphones on. So it's been really interesting, very good concepts that I've been reminded of that I can actually go and execute in my own work as a change maker. But yeah, happy to hear if there's any more reflections on a couple of ideas that I put in the chat. But if not, then a super well spent 1 hour.
Yeah, Mick, I saw you had a question. Thank you so much for the comment here. You had a question around the capital markets. And again, like I'm truly not an expert in capital markets. I do think that there might be two interesting ways to think about this. So one is, and this might be the German in me, but I do believe in governments actually having a role to play. And not just a very like American, Republican view of the government is like basically just there to get out of the way. So I do think that there is regulation can actually shift, smart regulation can actually shift markets. The second one on the capital market is that, and we see this a little bit with some of the larger pools of money. You saw BlackRock, for example, making very clear statements about where they want to invest their money. So there is a shift in markets when you look at where the capital deployment is actually being done. So outside of publicly traded markets, more on the secondary markets, more on private equity side, et cetera, where there is actually a lot of ability in the buying power of like large funds, hedge funds, et cetera. And again, Maggie, I guess to your point, I'm sure BlackRock doesn't do that out of pure altruism, but because they fundamentally believe that there's a business opportunity and it might just be the right thing to do. But I do think that we can shift markets a little bit with that. But again, like I think I wish we would have more of a smart conversation about regulations. And I'm not like a socialist, like over-regulated market person. But I do think that governments have a societal obligation to make sure that our systems are aligned for the benefit of society at large. And I think we should hold our leaders responsible to that.
Yeah, I mean, Pascal, thank you for bringing that in. And it's why, the League, we started investing more in government and public sector entrepreneurs, so they're the core, I think there was this shift, a few decades ago to saying, okay, well, business is going to come in and we're going to innovate our way out of all these problems. And business has made incredible strides, but we see again and again, our private sector entrepreneurs just bump up against these limits of the short term capital market constraints. And so if you want that thing to scale that isn't profit maximizing, but it's profit making, but it's solving real problems that need to be solved, then I absolutely agree that there's a role for policy making, to like create that playing field. And then those people investing in the way we want them to invest are rewarded for that, and not put on that they just have that level playing field. And so folks like Mick, who are in the public sector, thinking about that as well. And so so I love is what's happening now is we're just seeing entrepreneurs like in all parts of the system and the collaborations with the entrepreneurs. Because when you, again, coming back to the system in your Walmart example, it was entrepreneurs, it was entrepreneurs inside the manufacturers and in the retailers, the policymakers. It was all those people kind of playing their part and coming together to orchestrate these big shifts. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, Pascal. Thank you so much for
absolutely.
taking the time. I mean, both to write the book, and I really enjoy the book. I highly recommend it. It's very easy to flick through, and that's what I love about it. And there's just lots of good nuggets, and you summarize really well every chapter. And I also loved reading it. I got the sense lots of your interviews were done during the pandemic, and so I could just imagine these stilted Zoom calls and going
totally.
out, and you were able to get just these beautiful nuggets from people. So it's worthy of picking up and flicking through, and I'm sure you'll find definitely a few nuggets that you hadn't thought about before. But as always, it's great to have you as part of our community here and sharing your insights. So thank you.
Awesome, Maggie. Thank you so much.
I'd like to extend a big thank you to Pascal for joining us and sharing about his book. If you enjoyed today's episode and would like to explore more, you can find us at PATHFINDER'S Pod on Apple Music and Spotify. Thanks for listening. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.